Death costs suck. Well, they don't always suck, but in their current state they do. And here's why. There are a couple points I want to touch on throughout this video, but I'm going to start with the psychological aspect of it. The majority of places that have a high death cost, you're going to be making profit even if you die. Dying at AOD once an hour is only 14 mil out of the 50 mil per hour in drops. In the long run, you're still going to be raking in the profit and making the money to pay for those death costs. So the bad part about high death costs isn't necessarily that it eats too much into profit, but it feels bad to lose 10 mil or more GP in one instance of lag or one silly mistake. One good comparison I like to draw from is Stone Spirits, specifically at Nex. If you ask pretty much any Nex killer what the most annoying and unfun part of the boss fight is, almost every single one of them will probably tell you the Stone Spirit drops. While the GP per kill has gone up since the mining and smithing rework, largely due to the fact that the next armors see use in creating the best in slot armor in the game, it still feels as if you're making less money because of how many Stone Spirit drops you get. The human brain sucks and remembers the bad more than the good. Death costs work in a similar way. People remember losing the massive amount of GP to death, but their brain doesn't remember all the drops they made along the way. At this point, some of you are probably thinking, why are death costs even a big deal? Just wear Ring of Death all the time and it only costs 900k to die and you save your familiar too. And well, if I'm being honest, you're not wrong, but that doesn't make it good game design. In fact, I'd argue that it's terrible game design. It basically forces anyone who has high level gear to camp that ring for fear of paying too much for a death. It also compounds with that psychological point from before, where if you happen to forget to switch back to a Ring of Death or forget to charge it when you die, you're suddenly paying 10 mil plus more for a silly mistake. If we continue on this path without changing how death costs work, ring updates in the future will be lackluster because no ring in the game is worth giving up 10 mil in death costs. I've already replaced the Reaver's Ring in all my presets with the Ring of Death again, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. That ring was hella fun to use, and I want to use it, but I can't justify the costs associated with it. I just die too often. One major point that is often overlooked with death costs is entry to PVM. Group PVM can be very elitist as people only want to go with other people they know are competent either by their other boss cases or by having a specific tag in a Discord. This is due to a varying number of reasons, but one of the larger factors for me is death cost. If I bring someone new to Solak, they are more likely to kill me or more likely to make a mistake that will make the kill long enough that I run out of food and then die. It heavily disincentivizes me from teaching people when the game should incentivize me to do that. Reducing death costs for the entire team when there is a learner is a great way to break down the barriers of elitism in group PVM. Just look at how successful Free Death Week was. I brought 3 friends to Solak that I never had before. We died a lot, learned a lot, and now I'm comfortable taking any one of them to Solak now that death costs are back in full force. And if you scroll through any amounts of social media over the past week during Free Death Week, you'll have seen how many players took new challenges and took advantage of the Free Death Week to learn something that they can now use on a regular basis. I should mention as an aside that practice mode does exist and it's often underused for solo PVM. Most people should learn under that, and when you're close to a kill, you should swap off of practice mode. I did that while learning Raksha, for example. Once I was getting to P4 consistently, I went back into regular mode. I died a couple more times before my first kill, and even more after that, but the 20 or so deaths I had getting to P4 consistently were free, with the only cost being supplies, potions, food, and bolts. You're unlikely to get a group PVM to use practice mode just because even if you die as a learner, the rest of the members of the team can probably clean up the kill anyway. So they're going to want to do regular mode and not forego the drops they would get. Now that we know why high death costs are bad, let's look at the symptoms of why death costs are high in the first place. Arguably, the biggest problem with death costs is how hard they scale, and it's part of the core death mechanics that were designed back in 2014. It comes from 2 main factors. First of all, you pay 0% of death cost for the items you protect. That number is from 3 to 5 depending on if you have protect item on, had a portent of item protection, or if you have the hoarding perk. The second reason is that you pay a marginal tax rate based on the value, with the highest bracket being 10 mil GP or higher. There's no lower tax rate for 50 mil, 100 mil, 250 mil, or even 500 mil. So an item that's 15 mil and an item that's 1 mil, you're paying the same tax rate on, which makes for some very weird scaling. But let's start with the first one. Because you pay 0% on the first 3 to 5 items, as long as you keep under 5 expensive items, your death costs are virtually nothing. My AFK Rathus preset has a T92, an Essence of Finality, Cinderbanes, and 3 pieces of Trim Masterwork in it, which is 6 total expensive items. But I'm only paying 537k to reclaim all of these high level items. So high death costs are not about having high level gear, it's about having more than 5 pieces of high level gear. This also highlights an issue that dual wield is punished even harder. If I take the identical setup but replace my T92 two-hand weapon with T92 dual wield weapons, now my weapons take up 2 of the 3 slots, and the Trim Masterwork legs need to be paid as they are no longer being protected. If any of you have done your taxes recently, you'll know what a marginal tax rate is. But for those of you that haven't yet, essentially what a marginal tax rate is, that is the rate you're paying on the next dollar. An example would probably help to show how that comes into play, and let's use actual numbers from the game to determine the reclaim value of 2 random items from my Rathus preset: Laceration Boots and Masterwork Spear of Annihilation. Starting with the Laceration Boot. On the first 10,000, we pay a 15% rate, so that's 1,500 GP. The next 40,000, we pay 10%, so 4,000 more. And then from 50k to 250k, we pay 5%, which is another 10,000 GP. And for the 250k to 1 mil band, we pay 15,000 GP as the rate has lowered down to 2%. As you can see, as the item gets more expensive, you pay a smaller percentage of it, which is a core part of making deaths cheaper. Laceration Boots are worth 2.9 mil, so we don't need to worry about any future brackets as it fits into the next bracket, which is 1 mil to 10 mil. And the tax rate on that bracket is 1. And when we add that all together, the total cost to reclaim is 50,057 GP, which is a fair amount for a set of T80 boots. Now let's look at a much higher level item, the Masterwork Spear. And while we go through this, let's see if you can notice the problem. We can skip all the way up to the 1 mil bracket as the numbers are the same as the Laceration Boots, but this time we use up the entire 1 to 10 mil bracket, which is a 1% tax rate, so 90k for the bracket. Now, that's the last bracket. Yeah, at 10 mil, they stop scaling, and from now on, it's just 0.5% of the total GP value of the item above 10 mil, which leads to a total of 2.61 mil for that bracket. And if we add in the previous numbers, you have 2.73 mil in total reclaim cost for the spear. The big obvious problem is that the last bracket is at 10 mil. This death system was designed in 2014 where the cost of PVM items was much smaller, and there were very few items that costed much over 10 mil. And if they did, they were your primary weapon and likely kept in the top 3 to 5 items. In 2021, that's no longer the case. EOFs, flanking switches, hybriding, and other switches lead to very expensive item reclaim costs. If you add in additional layers of scaling with the tax rate being 0.5% for 10 to 50 mil, 0.25% for 50 to 250 mil, and then 0.1% for 250 mil or higher, you end up with a system that still punishes death, which is very important, but no longer as hard and as scaled as before. I calculated out all the reclaim costs for T90s and T92s for melee to see how it would play out under my new system. As you can see, the reclaim costs for the cheaper items like Dragors are virtually unaffected as they don't get that high above the 50 mil threshold to get the lower marginal rate. But when you get into the Nox Scythe or the T92 tier weapons, you can really see the impact of smaller scaling for more expensive items. With this new system, you can put yourself in a situation where you can have a T92 not in the top 3 to 5 items, and you aren't paying an arm and a leg when you do eventually die without a Ring of Death on. I recalculated my AOD preset with this new scaling, and it was 6.5 mil, which is 4.1 mil lower than what it currently is in game. Still a pretty large death cost and something you'd want to avoid, hence keeping the punishment there, but stings a lot less to see. I think this scaling works much better with the current landscape of PVM in 2021, as the meta is focused around switches and very expensive gear. Back in 2014, there wasn't as many switches or even expensive gear beyond your own weapon. If Jagex wants to keep the core system the same while scaling down death costs, this is an elegant solution for them to implement. However, I think there are better and more complex ways of dealing with the death system. Changing the scaling only kicks the can down the road when there's going to be even more expensive items 5 years from now, and we run into the exact same situation. There are many, and a lot of them work well, and I'm just going to quickly rapid fire off 3 of them that I like here. First off, we have the Ring of Death stand in Death's office. Basically, the idea behind that is it would cost a certain amount of Reaper points to learn how to build. It would be made out of a Ring of Death and construction materials to be a GP sink, and could be repaired with onyxes and more construction materials. The idea behind this is that it would cost slightly more to die with the Ring of Death stand than with the regular Ring of Death because of the excess construction materials, but it would guarantee that it would always go off even if you DC or forget to put your ring back on. The second idea is to allow the Ring of Death to be infused into other rings. This would again cost a certain amount of Reaper points to do, but it would allow you to use your Ring of Death on any other ring to infuse the Ring of Death into that ring, giving the passive death cost effect. This is quite the powerful effect, but it also creates a good Hydrix sync because instead of needing one Ring of Death, the players will now need a Ring of Death for each ring they use. For me, I would probably infuse a Ring of Death into my Ring of Vigor for ultimates and special attacks, my Asylum Surgeon ring, as that would probably be my new ring I use when I need the accuracy, and then the Reaver's ring, which is the recently released Best in Slot ring, and I'd want to store the Ring of Death effect in that for when I don't need the accuracy. That's 2 more Ring of Deaths bought and synced out of the game. And every time Jagex adds a new cool ring that people want to use, that's another Hydrix gone in the form of a Ring of Death infusion. The third and final idea is centered around not charging people based on the GE price of the item. Instead, you would scale it to the actual tier of the item. Note that these numbers would be subject to change, but they are just here for example's sake. Every T92 main hand weapon would be 200k to reclaim, the offhand would be 100k to reclaim, and the two-hand would be 300k, making a parity between dual wield and two-hand. That also creates a static value to expect to pay for death and doesn't come at the whim of the GE market fluctuation. This is shown best by the T90 tier as the prices are all over the place. Ascensions are expensive due to the keystone required to kill the Legios, while Dragors are really cheap as the boss is massable and very accessible. That makes melee much cheaper to use death cost wise than ranged. As a whole, death makes up a large portion of the GP synced out of the game, so any change to death cost will have to come with an additional gold sync, and the most obvious one is to tax the Duel Arena. They did it on old school, and it's been wonderful for syncing billions upon billions of GP out of the game. That's about all I wanted to cover in this video. Death costs suck in their current state, but have the potential to be a good mechanic if some tweaks are made. What are your thoughts on death costs? Too much? Too little? Anything? If you enjoyed the video, leave a like down below, and if you're enjoying the content I'm creating, consider subscribing. As I'm recording this, I'm about 70 subs away from 10,000, so if you could just knock the sub button to get us up over 10k for this video, that would be freaking awesome. But past that, have a good day, and I'll catch you in the next one.